Someone's going to need to tell Pastor Charlie that his puppets were misbehaving this week. I learned a very important lesson this week. Always read the text before agreeing to be a guest preacher in a congregation. I've run into this issue a few times where I'll say, of course I'll supply preach or whatever, and then I will get to Sunday morning and think, ooh, these are the texts for the day. That's interesting. I don't know about any of you, but for me, the gospel reads like a rhetorical question to which the answer is, thanks be to God? Is this all the news there is this week? And is it good? Suppose I've exposed my true colors, which is a bit risky because I'm meeting, I think, all of you for the first time today. The texts that we read today weave us into their webs. These stories seep into our lives, and they move around the furniture of our faith while we're busy working on other things. They turn the world upside down in God's topsy-turvy reign, where the last are first, and the first are last, and the hungry are fed, and the rich are empty. We drop into Joseph's story near its end, and the context is important here. Joseph's brothers were jealous of him. As a child, he'd had these crazy dreams. And could you imagine your punk kid brother coming up to you and saying, just so you know, I'm going to be better than all of you. I'm going to be better at everything than all of you, and you're going to bow down to me, and basically God said so. So his brothers hatched a plan. They sold him into slavery, pocketed the cash, and brought Joseph's coat dipped in blood as evidence that he'd died. Now, for those of you playing along at home, Joseph's dad is who? Jacob. And Jacob knew a thing or two about deception, but he had nothing on his kids. I know this from experience in which my 3-year-old regularly outsmarts me. I have no idea what we're going to do when he gets older. So Jacob, for those of you playing along at home, had cheated his brother out of his birthright, and then he glued fur onto his arms so that his dying father would give him the deathbed blessing. And he promptly ran for his life. And then he ends up wrestling with a strange man until daylight and receives another blessing and a new name, Israel. Jacob's first name is Cheater, and his second name is Fights with God and Humans. Jacob gets ahead by deception, cheating, and wrestling. But Joseph, his son, plays by the rules, and instead becomes a slave and eventually lands in prison. During his time in prison, the Pharaoh has some peculiar dreams, one of them of an upcoming famine. And because Joseph was able to correctly interpret these dreams, he becomes one of the Pharaoh's trusted advisors. So the foretold famine comes, and Joseph's family comes in search of food. His brothers continue trying to hatch a plan to save themselves and absolve them of selling their own brother into slavery. But their plan isn't necessary. God shows up in the midst of the mess they created, and he preserves Joseph and uses Joseph to preserve his brothers. So the news today is good if you're one of Joseph's brothers, but it's not so good for those of us who recognize the truth of the story. That the good news comes in the face of the bad news, that Joseph's own flesh and blood was so jealous of him, they'd rather regard him as dead than marvel at God's work through him. And it's interesting, I catch myself nodding along with this story as if this is how I expect the story to go. As if this is how the world works. But this story doesn't seem to tell the truth of how the world works. Again and again, like Joseph's brothers, jealousy tempts us to cut off relationship. Stress pulls up a seat at the table, and tempers run short. And when things don't work out, we quickly forget and blame and shame ourselves or those around us. But if things do work out, we also quickly forget that the secret to our success is very often not our own efforts. And oftentimes when we experience success, we forget about God. The world teaches us if they hit you, what should we do? Hit back. And Joseph's brothers anticipated this worldly response. At the end of the story in Genesis 50, they say, "We are here as your slaves." I think believing that Joseph's response to them will be to measure back what they had given him. But Joseph chooses a different path and invites us into this topsy-turvy reign of God. He says to his brothers in Genesis 50:20, "Even though you intended to harm me, God intended it for good, in order to preserve a numerous people, as he is doing today." Joseph himself weaves himself into a larger narrative, going all the way back to Abram, who God promised offspring as numerous as the stars, even though he and Sarai were barren. Turn the other cheek, Luke says, and love your enemies. Bless those who persecute you, and while you're at it, give to all those who are in need and cannot repay. If we think that what Jesus asks of us today is expected or easy, I don't think we're taking him seriously. And if we think following these commands is hard, but possible, I think we misunderstand him. If the reading from Luke today throws a wrench into how the world works, I think we're a bit closer to the mark. We say thanks be to God as God turns our world upside down. It's important to bear in mind that the text from Luke follows directly on the heels of Beatitudes and woes. The Beatitudes address the haves and the have-nots, or better, the have-nothings. The Beatitudes addresses the poor, the hungry, the mourning, and the oppressed, people who the world doesn't think of receiving any blessing, and says, yes, you will receive a kingdom. You will be filled. You will laugh, and you are the prophets of this kingdom. This upside-down world of the reign of God changes the rules of how we live, but the world itself is going to remain the same. People will still try to get ahead at the expense of others. People will still get cancer, be fired, and get divorced. In the first century Greco-Roman world, where most people lived at or just below subsistence level, which means they had just enough food to keep them alive and none beyond that. People were still poor, and they were still hungry, even after Jesus said the Beatitudes. Faith in a kingdom that makes the last first and the first last was as laughable in the first century as it is in the 21st. But this is the kingdom of which Jesus speaks. And I don't know about you, but I find myself wanting to protest. Jesus, you can't mean for us to live in the world like this. And Jesus turns the other cheek, as if to say, yes, yes I do. We live in a world where enemies troll each other on social media instead of talking to one another. But Jesus says, love your enemies. And like the lawyer who encounters Jesus, we ask, and who is my neighbor? It turns out your neighbor is in need of mercy because they bear the image of God. And Jesus is asking you, all of us, to supply it. We live in a world where hatred fills our hearts more easily than love. Jesus says, do good to those who hate you and bless those who curse you. But this is not how the world works, Jesus. But Jesus didn't come to reinscribe how the powers and principalities of the earth work. Jesus came to transform through the power of love. And the power of this transformation isn't just ideological, it's tangible. We live in a world where if someone strikes our cheek, we hit them back and harder if possible. But Jesus asks us to turn the other cheek. Notice that Luke doesn't address those who are doing the hitting. It addresses the person who's been hit. And some, in the light of this, argue that turning the other cheek empowers the victim and offers an affront to the honor of the person who would be hitting someone else. I don't think this impulse is wrong, but I think it's more complex. I think that Jesus, in his ministry of healing, teaching, dying, and rising, stands in our place. Having been baptized with us, having walked with us as our path becomes treacherous, and having prepared the way to the cross, Jesus, as a victim of cruelty and hate, reminds us that his image has borne humanity's tendency to hit back and to cause pain to one another. We live in a world where we see people holding up signs, hungry, need help, God bless, on nearly every street corner. And most of us most days drive by. Sometimes maybe we'll provide a meal or some cash. But the fact of the matter is so often when people ask, even Christians find it complex to give. In Luke, Jesus speaks of the grace that inaugurates a kingdom among the poor, fills the hungry, and dries the tears of the mourning. Jesus also speaks of the risk for those of us who would trust in our wealth more than we trust in God. And indeed, Martin Luther in the 16th century said that mammon, or wealth, was one of the most tempting gods in which humans put their trust. And I think it is still true. Luther says that our God is the one in whom we put our trust. Instead, God asks us to trust in God, to recognize the prophets of the kingdom among us, to look at the compliments and insults that the world might hurl at us as saying nothing about us in the face of what Jesus has said to us. Child, beloved, mine. This is a kingdom where God places enemies, perhaps Democrats and Republicans, pro-life and pro-choice, Fox News and NPR, all sit at the same table and love each other. It's a kingdom where hatred does not have the final word and goodness prevails. It's a kingdom where there is no need to turn the other cheek. All are clothed, and everyone has enough. And instead of asking what sort of credit, for those of you who are reading along with me, you noticed I shifted the words of the gospel. Because the word used is a word that's often translated as grace or favor elsewhere. And I think we would do well when we read this text to ask, what sort of grace do we believe in? If we love only those who love us, what sort of grace do we believe in? If we do good only to those who do good to us, what sort of grace do we believe in? If we're generous only with those who might give us something in return, what sort of grace do we believe in? We believe in the sort of grace that creates the universe and all that's in it. We believe in the sort of grace that looks at sinners and names them beloved. We believe in the sort of grace that imagines geriatric couples like Abraham and Sarah and Zechariah and Elizabeth, all well into their 80s or 90s, being blessed with children. We believe in the sort of grace that, like Joseph, chooses relationship over pride and self-preservation. We believe in a grace where those who wrestle with God, like Jacob, receive blessing, and those who cannot bear their own guilt, like David, are restored. We believe in the sort of grace where the voice of the prophets come and remind us of the need for mercy and peace. We believe in the sort of grace into which a baby is born to a poor, unwed teenage mother and is the son of God. We believe in the sort of grace that raises the dead. This, dear friends, is the sort of grace that seeps into your life and moves around the furniture of your faith, inviting you to see the world with new eyes. What sort of grace do we believe in? We believe in grace that has the power to transform the world by turning it upside down. Thanks be to God.